3, 1.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. With that, we move on to the keynote address. And it's my pleasure and honor to welcome and introduce Robert Beaglehole, Professor Emeritus of the University of Auckland. And he also chairs ASH, Action for Smokefree Aotearoa, and the Lancet NCD Action Group. Robert, over to you.
Good morning. My name is Robert Beaglehole from New Zealand. I'm an emeritus professor at the University of Auckland. I'm a former director of the Department of Health Promotion and Chronic Diseases at WHO Geneva, and I chair the board of ASH, Action for Smoke-Free 2025. I should say that I have a long history of engagement with tobacco control issues, both as an epidemiologist initially, more recently as a public health physician, and now the role I have is to support and encourage evidence-based interventions to reduce the harmful effects of tobacco. This little talk will focus a lot on the New Zealand experience, but there are lessons for other countries in the world and in the Asian Pacific region. I'd like to begin by saying that New Zealand has had a long history of tobacco control measures. And I think the recent history began in about 1990 with the Smoke-Free Environments Act, which was focused on sales of cigarettes to young people, was focused on replacing sponsorship of tobacco companies for sports and cultural events, and most importantly, focused on reducing the harmful effects of secondhand smoke. Now, that 1990s legislation was world leading, and the legislation has been modified extensively since then. New Zealand, a founding member of the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, and we have implemented all the recommendations of the FCTC and the associated Empower set of interventions. We've implemented these interventions to the highest degree. At the same time as these interventions have been introduced, the smoking rates, adult smoking rates, youth smoking rates, have slowly declined. But they haven't declined as fast as we'd like or equally. And smoking cigarettes is now a marker of poverty. Wealthy people, educated people, employed people, white people have benefited enormously. Our Indigenous population, New Zealand Maori, and the Pacific population have not shown the same degree of benefit, and poor people are still struggling very, very heavily with smoking-induced diseases. A turning point in New Zealand was in 2011 when the government adopted the Smoke-Free 2025 goal for the country as a whole. And the target is for the country to be 95% smoke-free by 2025, an adult daily smoking prevalence rate of less than 5%. And other countries, and I understand including India, have set similar goals, perhaps for a later date. We haven't made as much progress as we would like towards this goal, and we're not yet on track. However, progress, I am confident, will be more rapid over the next 3 or 4 years, because this government, the current government, is introducing Smoke-Free Action Plan to accelerate progress. The government has also recognized that the real problem is smoke, not nicotine. And in New Zealand, the goal has always been to be smoke-free, not tobacco-free, not nicotine-free, and now not vaping-free. And I think this has been a very important guiding principle. The government recognizes that the problem is smoked tobacco. The government recognizes that the main public health challenge are deaths in adults, middle-aged adults, older adults, particularly for disadvantaged people. What gives me cause for optimism in the New Zealand context is that we have the tool available now to accelerate progress. The Framework Convention, the Empower interventions do not give sufficient attention to reducing the harms of smoked cigarettes. We know that people smoke for the nicotine, become dependent on nicotine, but they die from the smoke. And of course, in the Indian situation and the Asian context, there are other forms of tobacco, oral tobacco, which have deadly consequences, which we don't have for a variety of reasons in New Zealand. So we have this tool for tobacco harm reduction in the form of alternative sources of nicotine. We've had this for some time in the form of nicotine replacement therapy, patches, gums, inhalers. But those forms of nicotine replacement are not very effective. They do not deliver a sufficient dose of nicotine to the brain to substitute for many people for the nicotine that can be provided most efficiently through smoked cigarettes. We now have vaping, electronic cigarettes, and they've been available in New Zealand seriously for about 5 or 6 years, globally for longer. And they are, in some circles, a controversial innovation. The New Zealand government, in its great wisdom, believes that they have an important role in reducing the unique harms of burning cigarettes. It took a while for the vaping situation to be legislated and regulated. And in the early years, it is fair to say that the tobacco industry went wild. But since the end of 2020, the vaping situation has been legislated, regulated, and controlled. The vaping legislation had 2 aims. One, of course, was to reduce adult harms from tobacco by encouraging adult smokers to transition away from cigarettes. The other, most importantly and critical from a political point of view, was to discourage young people from vaping. And that has been a driving force of the legislation, attempting to get the balance between helping adults transition away and protecting young people from vaping. Over the last 2 years, the adult daily smoking rate has declined most dramatically in New Zealand. Of course, it's hard to be specific as to the reasons for this decline, but there has been a very close association with the increase in vaping. As vaping rates in adult increase, smoking rates decline. It is also true, and of concern to many people, including me, that vaping rates in young people have increased. No one wants young people to vape. No one wants non-smokers to vape. But the increase in vaping in young people has not been associated with an increase in smoking cigarettes. Smoking rates in young people have collapsed. An amazing, successful public health achievement. About 1% of 14 and 15-year-old young people in New Zealand now smoke on a daily basis. Young people have given up smoking. And it is true that some of them are vaping. Many of the youth vapers are perhaps youth smokers attempting to get off smoking. So we have a tool now to reduce the harms of smoked tobacco. And if we are to achieve the Smokefree 2025 goal, we have to focus on adult smokers, encouraging them to quit, transition away from the most harmful products to less harmful products. And we know with quite a degree of confidence that vaping is much, much less harmful than smoked cigarettes. Public Health England, other agencies suggest that vaping is 95% less harmful. And I support that assessment. It also is effective in helping people quit and transition away from cigarette smoking. And in the New Zealand context, with very, very high cigarette prices as a result of years and years of increased taxation, vaping is much less costly than smoking. And this is, of course, is very important given that smoking is concentrated amongst the poorest segments of our population. So I'm optimistic that we can make progress. Our government is in the end stages of developing a legislative plan for accelerating progress towards the Smokefree 2025 goal. A very ambitious plan, a very bold plan, a world-leading plan. The essence of the plan is a desire to make smoked cigarettes less acceptable, less available. And there are several elements to this plan which may be of interest to other countries. One, very popular with the public, is to create a smoke-free generation, to ban the sale of cigarettes to any person born after a particular date. And the date suggested in New Zealand is 2009. Currently, cigarettes and vapes are not legally available for sale to people under the age of 18. And so that age of sales would gradually increase year by year, so that eventually there would be no legal sales to young people. And that's the notion of a smoke-free generation. It has been talked about by other jurisdictions, but I think no one is at this stage as far advanced as New Zealand is in introducing a legislative smoke-free generation. And we can discuss the pros and cons of that. I would say, however, that we are very close to a smoke-free generation now in New Zealand, if we haven't already achieved it. But this does signal the government's concern with youth smoking, and that is a very, it's good that the government is concerned about that issue. The other initiatives, two others I'll just mention briefly. One is to reduce the number of outlets at which cigarettes can be bought. At the moment, they're readily available throughout the community and particularly available in convenience stores what we call dairies, gas service stations, gas stations, supermarkets, and particularly in poorer parts of the country. And the aim is to significantly reduce the number of outlets over a course of several years. And the third most interesting aspect of the government's proposed legislation is to mandate the sale of denicotinized cigarettes, cigarettes without the nicotine. The idea being that these forms of cigarettes will be the only ones legally available, and they'll be so unpleasant and so unsatisfactory to smoke, as they are, that people will move away from smoked cigarettes and hopefully be encouraged to quit smoking altogether. This is a very interesting proposal, one that hasn't been tried anywhere else in the country, world leading again. And it is, in effect, would be a ban on nicotine containing cigarettes. Other aspects of the legislation will be to recognise the importance of leadership, particularly by Indigenous Maori people in New Zealand, so that they have control over implementation of these legislative proposals. I think the government recognises, and many do in the tobacco control field, that these legislative proposals are radical, ambitious, bold, but we need to be careful to ensure that the alternative nicotine products are widely available and promoted. And at the same time, as people are unable to smoke their favourite fully nicotinized cigarettes, that we deal with illicit trade, already beginning to be an issue, if only because cigarettes are so expensive in New Zealand. There's a lucrative market for illicit imports. So we need to control that. We need to make sure that the reduced harm products are supported, promoted, remain cheap, and of course regulated and controlled. So that's the situation in New Zealand. And I'm sort of optimistic. I mean, being in public health for all the years that I've been in public health, I find that optimism helps. But with the tobacco harm reduction tools available, with the government committed to them, I think we can make progress. I think we can also provide lessons for other countries. And I think a key lesson is that progress is complex, multifactorial, and there's not one thing that makes the difference. And I think the Framework Convention proposals, at least some of them, should be a starting point for all countries. And of the various Empower interventions, I particularly encourage price increases, although I recognise that they do discriminate poor people and that they are, in practice, regressive, although, of course, poor people will have the most to benefit if they can stop as a result of the price increases. So taxation is important. The Framework Empower suggests 70% of the price of tobacco products be taxation, money for the government. We've achieved that in New Zealand and several other countries. I would also say that mass media and social media campaigns to promote smoke-free state are also important. And in the New Zealand context, the smoke-free environments aspect of the various legislative measures have been important. But putting aside those essential components of Empower, WHO's proposals, I think all governments should recognise the importance of the smoke-free goal and the absolute central importance now of reducing harms from burnt tobacco. And that means, in my view, promoting the less harmful nicotine delivery products. In the New Zealand context, vaping is one of them. So I think with comprehensive policies which work with people where they are, which recognizes that nicotine dependence is central to the issue around harms caused by burning tobacco, replacing that nicotine with a less harmful product in the New Zealand context, and I think elsewhere, will be very important initiative. So I'd be delighted to discuss any of these issues at a convenient time. Thank you.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, that was Robert Beaglehole with the keynote address. Robert, we wish you, Ash, and the Lancet NCD Action Group the very best going forward. Well, that concludes the 4th edition of the Economic Times Consumer Freedom Conclave, the theme being reframing societal views on harm reduction, a medical and scientific perspective. I do hope you found the discussions around harm reduction products as an alternative to a tobacco-free nation and the laws governing the use of such products useful. On behalf of the Economic Times, this is your host, Ivan Rodrigues, signing off. Have a good day.